Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you in the room. So I thank the organizer for the kind invitation. So my presentation will be based on a policy paper that was published early March, and it's available online. We will be talking about the impact of the Inclusive Framework Agreement, or the expected impact of this agreement. I think it's important to stress that this is a historic agreement because it's the first of its kind for about a century. And it's also important to stress that it's not yet a done deal, in the sense we are not yet allowed to take implementation for granted. So this is being implemented in some places, and these are important 2 points to be stressed. Now, just maybe a quick word on the role of the IMF. So we are the IMF. We contribute to the debate on taxing multinationals by providing economic assessment, economic analysis. For instance, there has been, since 2009, 4 policy papers like the one that I'm presenting now. There has been a book in 2021 with chapters going into the detail of various specific issues among many working papers. And we also deal with this issue in our capacity development. So when we advise countries on how to mobilize revenue more generally, this is one of the topics that we usually discuss. So in my presentation today, I will try to give a little bit of a global perspective, and especially from a standpoint of low-income countries and developing countries, but also to some extent try to connect the debate a little bit to Sweden. I'm not going to talk about the 2-pillar reforms. It's throughout the presentation, I think this has been discussed. But let me start with this qualitative kind of assessment table. That's a table just to have a broad directions. Where do we stand? Where does the agreement put us? And also compared to more fundamental reform ideas. This is kind of qualitative traffic light type of table, so it should be interpreted with great caution. But just to put things into perspective. So if we think of Pillar 1, for instance, compared to current arrangement, Pillar 1 is an improvement. It provides more protection against profit shifting, which is what companies do, because when you tax based on consolidated accounts, it doesn't really matter where the company will report profits at a various jurisdictions. So in that sense, it's more robust to profit shifting as an idea. It's also providing more protection against tax competition, because consumers are, companies are less able to manipulate where their consumers are, and in that sense, also countries can put the tax rate under less pressure. It's in terms of practicality, not necessarily it's a system on top of the existing system. So in that sense, it's not making practically the implementation less easy than what we have right now. Legally, by definition, we would need to adapt this into our legal frameworks, into treaties and so on. So it's extra work. So there are some issues in terms of complexity regarding legal considerations and a practical implementability. However, it's also overall more suitable to the circumstances of developing countries. And the same is true basically for Pillar 2. So by and large, we can say that both pillars are improvement compared to the current system. But of course, both pillars have origins in more fundamental ideas. And compared to those ideas, their scope is less basically. And in that sense, they provide less, say, protection against profit shifting and tax competition compared to allocating the entire residual profit based on sales by destination, which would be far more robust to tax competition and profit shifting. Because Pillar 1 allocates only a portion, for example. Or also, if we look at the original idea of a minimum tax, Pillar 2 is less robust than original widespread kind of minimum tax, because a textbook-like minimum tax will not have exception for companies, will not have substance-based income exclusion, and so on. So this is just to say it's an important step in the right direction. I would like to say also importantly, on pillar one, and that's an idea that was already mentioned. I think the novelty here and the importance is that it brings a completely new idea to existing arrangement, and this is, it says, by destination, as a destination-based principle to taxation, and that's something we don't have right now. And even though the scope is relatively small, it's a very important idea. So on the effects, this has been mentioned before, but just to fix the idea. So there is a direct revenue impact. We wake up in the morning, the agreement has been implemented, how much money we can collect. Of course, that's a first static response, first static kind of reference point, but the world will react. Countries will react. They can change their taxes. They can implement more tax reforms. They can raise their taxes. And companies will react. They will react in terms of where they put their profits and also in terms of real investment decisions. And then there are also administrative and compliance costs. And we need to take all those effects into account if we are really serious in providing an assessment of the impacts, which is hard. Let me speak a little bit about the static impact. So this is a static revenue impact. First, I would like to say the results of the EU Tax Observatory are very similar to ours. And also, I would say, in the grand scheme of things, the OECD results that were just published, just presented by peers, are actually, by and large, at the same magnitude. So on Pillar 1, to give you a number that's not on the chart, we estimate that 2% of the global multinational profits base will be reallocated. 2% globally. So that's kind of a number that I think we can all reasonably compute, is subject to less uncertainty. Maybe it's a little bit more, maybe it's a little bit less, but that's the kind of the grand scheme of things. Where things become more uncertain is when we say who will get the revenue. So we know that's the pie, and now we want to reslice this pie. I think we are in agreement that investment hubs would tend to be the countries that will give up some of taxing rights on that excess profit. The estimate on their revenue impact will be between 2 to 3% of revenue. Who will get it? It would depend on sales by destination. Ideally, we would like to observe that at the company level. We do not, so we do some approximation. On average, it's something like 1% of corporate income tax revenues when we use macro allocation weights. So our approximations of these sales weights is based on national statistics. When we use CBC, we get less impact. I would like to say here, there is this an important point that, of course, that's the idea of Pillar 1 is that we implement the destination-based taxes. For that, we give up unilateral digital service taxes. And as it was mentioned in the previous presentation, the global average is kind of, it's the same revenue impact, because currently digital service taxes do not raise so much money, more than Pillar 1. But of course, for some individual countries, that would depend whether those companies will be in scope or not. On Pillar 2, we put the tax base that will be kind of impacted at around 17% of global multinational profits. And in terms of absolute value, we are also at 150 billion. So that's at the lower end of the OECD estimates, but very close to the EU Tax Observatory. We use, of course, a different year vintage, so that may explain. But if we put that as a percentage of global multinational profits, it's about 17% that will be subjected to a top-up tax. On average, in our calculation, very noisy average, that profit is currently taxed at around 5%. A little bit plus, a little bit minus, with some degree of uncertainty. So that means on average, kind of on that entire global profit that will be subjected to the top-up tax, there will be an increase of about 10 percentage point, basically, on the top-up tax. It doesn't really matter who will do it from a revenue impact, because it's the same top-up tax. So that's why we are comfortable showing global results, but we are less comfortable showing individual country-specific results, because it really would matter then who applies the QD, MTT, or who is not. We know this is the amount of profit that will be taxed more heavily or up to the top-up tax, but it's more difficult to pin down with certainty which country would take it. But just to be a bit provocative, for instance, regarding the results we heard about today coming from Sweden. So we heard, for instance, that on over the years, the amount of profit of Swedish multinational companies that was reported out of Sweden went down. So that might be already a reaction, just to say. So that may be meaning the impact on the firms is already taking place in some sense, and they are already reacting. And that's just to give one example. One bar chart I would like to stress in this slide, which is the last one, the 8.1 bar. That's already a dynamic impact, which is by itself larger than the static top-up tax impact. That's by itself. And how do we estimate this? We know in a tax competition theory that companies react in terms of their tax rate setting to other countries' tax rate. So when Sweden's major trading partners and investment partners reduce their taxes, that put pressures on Sweden to reduce its tax rate as well. And that has been a downward trend. For instance, Sweden now is around 20%, a little bit more. It used to be 26%, and even going back to the history, it was more. So what if Sweden's partner increase their taxes? And that's what would happen with the minimum tax, right? Because the low tax jurisdiction will go from 0 to 15. And some countries will even stop decreasing their taxes in the future. So all that mean, at least there is a lower probability, maybe, for a country like Sweden or other countries to lower their taxes, their corporate taxes going forward. And also, maybe they give them room to increase their taxes going forward. So that we call tax reaction function. And when we estimate that, we come up with a global revenue impact of 8%. This is extra. And that corresponds to an increase in average corporate income tax rate of 2 percentage points. So it's not a draconic increase. If we think, for example, some countries like the United Arab Emirates already introduced a corporate income tax. So that's for them already an increase from 0 to 9%, right? Some countries here close to the EU, they were thinking, should we decrease our taxes further? We wanted to go up, but then they said maybe we will not go up. Now they are considering seriously going up again. So that by itself is going in the direction of the dynamic impacts I'm talking about. And that's really important to take into account. So one point on this I would like to stress again regarding the discussion in the panel today. Are we going to converge to 15%? I don't see why. So now the floor is 0. And if we make the floor even higher, 15%, why should we converge to 15%? So maybe it's an empirical question, time will tell. But giving what we know in terms of the reaction function of countries to what happened abroad, we expect that if other countries raise their taxes, we will also raise our taxes. Maybe not 1-to-1, but it's unlikely that we will decrease our taxes in response. And remember, a broad decrease in the tax rate is costly because you will collect less from the immobile base. And by the same token, if you increase your corporate income tax by 1 percentage point, you are collecting more from the relatively immobile base. Okay, so I would like to say something on the subject to tax rule that was not discussed, but that's a rule basically that gives low-income countries a source-based taxation right on outbound payments, on specific outbound payments, if they are taxed below 9%. So we looked into that. Our results suggest that. So let me put it this way: every 1 in 5 treaties, so 20% of the treaties, have a withholding tax below 9% on interest, for instance. And every 4 in 5 treaties, so 80% of the treaties, will have actually lower than 9% on technical and management fees, a cross-border withholding tax. But when we take into account the home country nominal tax rate, which is how the subject to tax rule is currently drafted, we end up having only about 6% of all treaties will be subjected to the cross-border withholding tax. So that's in our assessment, which lends support to kind of reconsidering or increasing the scope of the subject to tax rule. But this is not being implemented yet. This is not being finalized. This is still under discussion. Other topic which is important for developing countries being still under discussion is the so-called Amount B that hasn't been discussed today. So these are simplification measures under Pillar 1 to basically for specific activities, redistributions, So the details are yet to be finalized. What will happen to investment? Investment, by definition, if we increase taxes, we expect investment to decline. However, we expect this to be muted, the effect. The reason being, we have substance-based income exclusion, so that's under Pillar 2 will dampen the effect on investment. Also, and that's very important to recall, is that the textbook version, when we say the tax rate went up in my country, so investment may go to other countries, right? That's not exactly how this agreement works, because other countries are also increasing their taxes. So that's something also to be taken into account. So it's there is some leveling of the play field. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in 2022 have a very good world investment report where they discuss the effect of the minimum tax, and they put the decline of the FDI globally at around 2%. They simulate the impact on global FDI because of the impact. Another thing is that to emphasize in this regard. In fact, investment may be relocated from low tax jurisdictions to some of the higher tax countries. So if we think of an investment now that left Sweden at the margin just because of some tax advantages somewhere else, if that tax advantage is being eliminated, that investment has now good reason to go back to the original calculation and reallocate to Sweden, for instance. And of course, by leveling the play field, that means other non-tax factors will become important for the investment decision. Okay, I feel I am in a race with the slides. They keep moving automatically, and I need to bring them back. So please, if I'm taking so much time, I'll stop. But let me speak a little bit on the profit shifting impact. So that has been discussed today a lot. We put the global revenue impact by reducing profit shifting at 1% globally. But this is, of course, it masks some heterogeneity. So some countries will gain far more. Some countries will lose a little bit, because especially, investment hubs and low tax jurisdictions, because there will be less profit shifted to their countries. We use some semi-elasticities that are existing in the literature at 1.2, but of course the effect might be non-linear. So here we are assuming a linear effect. What is the distance from me to the average world tax rate? That shrinks, so there is less incentives for my companies to shift profit abroad. But of course, the world is nonlinear. Depending on where is my position, maybe the reduction in the profit shifting will be even more. So the slides moved automatically. I will follow the speed. Just to say, complexity is particularly important for low-income countries, where they might have some competing priorities in terms of investing in their digitalization and in their human resources. So that's something to be taken into account. And also here, I would like to actually mention the point on the importance of providing information. So we have achieved very important progress on exchanging information, whether on individuals, but also country by country. But de facto, many low and middle income countries are not yet still receiving information as much as we wish to, and that's something to be improved in the future. Maybe I will skip the other reforms that are happening in the interest of time, but of course there are other things happening, including the United Nations work on model treaties to strengthen source-based taxation of digital services and some other payments. Let me just say, what will country do? I think QD-MTTT is a dominant strategy. It's just you are safe to implement it, whether you are capital importing country or capital exporting country. Because in easy word, what the QD-MTT is doing is saying, if a company will fall under the Pillar 2 scope, and maybe the foreign jurisdictions will collect the revenue, if I have the QD-MTTT, I will ensure that I don't leave money on the table. Loosely speaking, more or less, that's what the rule says. But of course, the reform is an opportunity, the agreement is an opportunity to do more, to revisit corporate income taxations by at a broader level. There is a scope to better tax excess profit, for example. That's a topic that's now being discussed in the EU. There is a scope to raise the tax rates, as I mentioned. In low-income countries, there is a scope to revisit the entire tax incentive schemes, tax holidays that are known to be very costly, ineffective, and inefficient. And now it's time really to revisit these tax incentives. Some tax incentives, some tax competition may remain under the agreement, so it does not fully eliminate tax competition incentives, but it's an opportunity to revisit these incentives because it does put a floor on tax competition. So maybe to one last slide before I conclude, just to put things into perspective, the corporate income tax reform is important. It brings revenue that are important for supporting financing need. But of course, for low-income countries, a lot of revenue are still needed. Some estimates suggest 16% in some low-income countries of GDP need to be raised to meet sustainable development goals. Maybe 8% lower than capacity. So if you estimate the potential of the tax system and what we are collecting right now, some low-income countries have scope to increase their taxes by 8%. Even if we look at low-income countries and we try to bring their average tax to the emerging market level, the last bar, there is a 5 percentage point of GDP that need to be increased. So that all says, of course, corporate income tax reforms are important for various reasons, and their contributions in terms of revenue is, of course, welcome. But other reforms are also important, especially in low-income tax environment. VAT, property taxes, personal income taxes are also important reform areas in low-income countries. So to conclude, I think, let me go to the concluding slide in the interest of time. The agreement is an important step in the right direction. It's an historic agreement. We should not take implementation for granted. So it's still kind of many things are being implemented. There is a scope to improve or widen the scope, let me say, of the agreement itself going forward or in the future. So some business need to be finished. That's simplification measures subject to tax rule, finalizing all the details, and special considerations for low-income countries. But of course, in going forward, one could envisage building on that agreement to even go further and widen the scope of the reform. And then to reap the benefits, the gains are not automatic, so countries need to implement things. In some high advanced countries is maybe just QD, MTTT, and doing some few amendment to the law. But in low-income countries, maybe there are wider reforms that are need to be taken and undertaken to reap the benefits of the global agreement. So with that, I would like to stop, and thank you, everyone.
We have some questions also, but I will start. I'm thinking of I have two questions, so it was very good. But the first on the traffic light slide, okay, where you had the colors, you have this. You call it a minimum, like a proper minimum floor or something. So if you could explain what that is, I didn't get it. And the other one was you had the figure 8%. If you can convert that to dollars or euros, maybe.
Yeah.
So that's my two questions.
So, that's for illustration. So if we look at a minimum tax in a textbook like, say, tax competition model, where we introduce a minimum tax, and then the question usually we ask, is that Pareto improving, meaning would that make countries better off or worse off? And in these standard tax competition models, you would make countries better off. So the high tax country will lose less profit toward the low tax countries, and the low tax countries will also be better off for a kind of moderate minimum tax, because they will collect higher taxes from a smaller base. So they will lose a little bit of profit shifting. But other countries, because the high tax countries will not reduce their taxes, so they will maintain also a little bit of profit shifting. So they will collect typically higher revenue, which is welfare improving. So in that textbook like minimum tax that I was just describing, there are no exceptions. So it's just minimum tax for everybody. So there is kind of no firms that are excluded because of a turnover threshold. There is no portion of the tax base will not be taxed. For instance, under Pillar 2, we have the substance-based income exclusion, which is not part of the global rules. So that's what I meant by kind of full-fledged textbook-like minimum tax. The amount of so let me I need to do the math, but so 6% of corporate global corporate income tax is around 150 billion. So that's 8%. So something like, I don't know, don't quote me on that, but maybe 200 billions, 180 billions globally, US dollar. So say because of an increase because of the dynamic impact by raising your tax rate.
Only the dynamic.
Only the dynamic, the 8% basically of global corporate income tax revenue. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. We have a question from Emil.
So great. Thank you very much for the presentation, also for bringing in the perspective of the low-income countries as well. So coming back previously, we had this discussion about revenue estimates for Sweden, while that's maybe not you shouldn't focus much on numbers as of today. We also did talk about potential gains from these dynamic effects from reduced tax competition. Can you say anything about like how you think this 8% of that will be distributed, let's say, at least between high and low-income countries? We don't have any figures for Sweden right now, but more broadly about this issue.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is an important question, and we were cautious in this study not to put figures country by country because of the uncertainty surrounding these. But from Sweden perspective, if I may just think out loud here in the room, and if because of the EU directive, we have a 15% then on the taxation of multinationals, meaning the mobile base within the EU. We know there is more or less already basically a minimum tax in the United States. Other countries in Asia are also moving this direction. So we heard, for example, South Korea is moving also toward implementing Pillar 2, basically, right? So this means it is less likely that in the future, to start with, less likely that in the near future, there will be ideas in Sweden to say, let's reduce the corporate income tax rate even further. I mean, it's already at around 20% because the pressure is relieved, basically, right? So that by itself is kind of dynamic impact. Now, if some countries going forward start even raising their taxes, including very large economies, maybe reconsidering their rate situation, that could even give a room in the future to say, well, maybe we can move back from 20 to 22%, which again, then the revenue gain will be not only by increasing the tax revenue from multinationals, but also from domestic, relatively mobile tax base. But of course, in the Nordic setup where we have quasi or similar to a dual income tax, then always the tax rate on dividends and at the individual level need to be taken into account. But this is the dynamic effects from the country tax setting perspective. The other aspect is companies, and that's what I already raised, is maybe, of course, we have a relatively small number of multinationals under Pillar 2. I saw the number 100. I'm citing, I don't know, I didn't see the data. But those companies will have less incentives to put profit in low tax jurisdictions. And as I said, maybe already some of these companies are actually reacting. And what we did not now attribute, or what the report did not attribute as gain because of Pillar 2. Maybe, I don't know, maybe some of that profit is already a reaction, already kind of internalized, embedded reaction of Swedish firms. Overall, I think by that's a little bit more on Pillar 1 rather than the dynamic of Pillar 2. But the idea is living in a world of coordination. I mean, the whole idea of the agreement is we heard that it's a global problem. If we want to solve it, we need coordination. And if we live in a world where we have some form of coordination, is maybe better than a world where we have so many unilateral measures. And that's actually also good for companies. So dealing with a more harmonized system is much easier than having multiple unilateral, very different systems. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Piers here.
Can I ask, in the STTR part, when you were looking at the statutory rate or the nominal rates in the partner jurisdiction, did you look at all at nominal rates that might be different from the statutory rate? Or did you just look at the statutory rate? Because it occurs to me that there may be countries with a high statutory rate that have some nominal rates applying to certain companies.
Yeah, no, this is a very important question. So indeed, we looked at kind of the legal framework, meaning what's in the bilateral tax treaty and what is the statutory tax rate. In some countries, there might be some patent boxes taxed at below 9%, although some European ones are adjusting upward, going to the 9%, for instance, in the Benelux context. But also in some developing countries, there might be some tax holidays, so these are not taken into account in that particular calculation. Yeah.
I can ask a question. What is the IMF's view on the state of negotiations in the future at the global level? We see important initiatives in Latin American countries at the UN. We have already initiatives at the OECD and in African countries, in European countries. Does the IMF have a view on where the next big negotiations will be coming in the next few years?
So we at the IMF, we contribute to the debate by providing economic analysis, by trying to have an independent analysis of various reform options. And we plan to continue contributing to this debate. We also support all collective actions to resolve problems with spillovers, and including tax spillovers. And that ideally will be solved at a global level. So we have a coordinated global solution to resolve these spillovers, but also regional cooperations are also important. And for example, the EU can showcase that coordination can work among highly integrated economies and moving toward implementing Pillar 2. So in that sense, regional coordination is also important to foster a global agreement on issues with spillovers, including taxation, of course.
All right. I think that was the last question. And a big thank you to both of you. All three of you, of course, coming here to Sweden to talk about this. And you pushed the tax debate forward just in this very day quite a bit. And from SACO, we don't give flowers, but we give something, a little money to Scholars at Risk. It's an organization. So that's the flowers we give to you presenting here today. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.